Okay, so today's topic is controller advice, and the reason for that is to centrally control the exception handling. Okay, so if I go to employee controller, for example, if I go here, you will see few things. For example, if I go to, let's say, delete mapping, here you would see that my delete employee by ID throws an exception, something like this. Okay, and then if I come here, I have to catch it like this. Okay, and if there is a exception being thrown at this point, then I have to go here, catch it, and then return based on whatever is the exception. And I have to do this at many places. So I have to do this here, I have to do this in the delete. And primarily why I'm doing this is for put and delete, primarily is because for put I have to have an employee ID for me to edit it, because put mapping is all about editing it. And for deletion of an entity, deletion of the employee, again I will have to have an ID, the existing ID for which I want to delete. If existing IDs are not present, then I will have to return a statement saying I cannot delete something because employee does not exist. So these are exceptions which I have to place in multiple places. Okay, and this is what I would like to avoid. I want to control these exceptions at a central place, and that is what controller advice concept in Spring Boot gives me. Okay, so what I am trying to do now is, as I said,
Hello.
yeah, can you hear me? Okay, can you guys please go on mute if you're not speaking? Okay, so I forgot what I was saying. Yeah, so the reason we are using controller advice is to centralize the exception handling so that we don't have to keep things individually in different methods. Rather, we have something called as a listener, which listens to the exceptions being thrown by the endpoints and manipulate, or maybe based on what you want to send, you can put those error codes or those messages directly on those in that listener or in that controller advice, and then you don't have to define all those things here. Okay, so that is basically is the fundamental idea of why I'm using controller advice to set, again, just a single line to centralize the exception handling. Okay, to centralize the exception handling, if someone asks you what how do we handle exceptions in Spring Boot, you can use word called as controller advice. Or if the question is what is the use of controller advice, you would say it is used to centralize the exception handling in a Spring Boot application. Okay, plain and simple. Now, how we implement it is what I'm going to be showing today. Okay, but first let's see how our API looks like. Okay, wait. uh, can you guys see my screen, or is just coming black?
We can see.
Can see, huh? Okay. Okay. uh Wait. Give me a minute. Okay, can you see now?
Yeah.
No, right? I don't know what's happening. Okay, anyway, so what we will do now is, first we have to go and see how our API looks like. So API is like this. For example, if I go to put, if I say try it out, I say execute, I get a message, employee does not exist, cannot edit. Okay, why? Because I'm trying to edit a employee ID which is not there. And this is a message which I am getting saying employee does not exist and cannot edit. Where it's coming from, if I go to my employee controller and if I go to my put here in the edit employee, this is what I'm getting. Okay, now I want to modify this. Here what I'm doing is I'm saying exist by ID, I'm saying save, and I'm throwing a new exception, employee does not exist, cannot edit. And that is what is being thrown from this method, which is actually coming here. And since this line is throwing an exception, it is getting caught here. Okay, and this is what is getting returned with the message, and this is what is actually coming here, employee does not exist, cannot edit. Okay, I want to modify this. This is not the right way. I shouldn't say right way, there is a better way of handling this. So first thing what I would do is I would go and create an exception. Okay, right now if you see inside edit employee, I am sending a generic exception. Okay, what I will do now is to show you how to create your own exception. Okay, which exception which represents the actual problem. Okay, here I'm simply saying exception, a generic thing, and then here I'm passing the message. Instead of doing that, all I would do is I'll go to new, I'll say class, and I'll say employee not exist, employee does not exist, exception. I'll create a class, and here I will extend this with extends runtime exception. Okay, inside this I will go and create a constructor. I'll create a constructor, and here I will pass on the string as message, and here I will write super. Super is how I call the parent class constructor, and here I will say super and I will say message. And that's how you create a user defined exception. Okay, so far if you have remember, so far all you do is keep on throwing the generic exceptions which you find here. So for example, if I come here, I'm throwing exception. It's a generic Java, it's a generic exception which is present in Java, and that is what you are sending. But I can also create my own exceptions this way. I can say my class name is employee does not exist exception. I think I should change this name, it's exit exist exception refactor. Okay, and here I'm saying is if this exception is being called, it has to go and call the constructor of the parent class, which is runtime exception. So this is a way by which you can define your own custom exception classes. Okay, how to make use of them? Now I'll go back to service, and now instead of throwing this generic exception, I will now throw employee exception. So I'm not throwing the generic exception at the moment, I'm throwing the employee does not exist exception. And here I'm passing employee does not exist, cannot edit. Now employee does not exist exception, we know as name, the name of the class itself is employee does not exist, so I don't have to send this message. I will simply say cannot edit. Cannot edit what? I cannot edit, I can also mention what I cannot edit. So I'll say cannot edit the employee with ID as employee.getID. I think I should make this brighter. Maybe it makes viewing easy. Okay, so I go back. So I'm saying throw new employee does not exist exception, cannot edit the employee with ID as employee.getID. Okay, so instead of sending the exception, I'm sending the user defined exception as employee does not exist exception. Okay, if I go back, sorry, to controller here, I have to do few things. So I'm here as saying as employee service dot edit employee, and then if this works, then return the edited employee. Fine, but if there's an exception, then return something else. And I don't want to do this. I don't want to handle exceptions in my controller. I want to handle exceptions in my controller advice, which I will be creating in a while. So what I'll do is I will just comment these things out. Okay, I don't want this, and I don't want this. Here all I would need is that if an employee is edited, okay, then return something, return saying http status as 201 or something, and body as this. But if there is a problem with the addition, if there's a problem with adding, if there's a problem with editing that specific, making change in that specific employee, then I would say throw an exception of type, because here I'm throwing an exception of type. Let me throw exception type this employee does not exist exception. So I want to throw exception of type employee does not exist. Okay, let me remove this again. uh, so throws employee does not exist exception, and I want to throw the same thing here. I want to say throws employee does not exist exception. Okay, so this is basically what I want to do. Now if I run this, it won't work, but still I would like to go and run this. Let's see what happens. If I go and run this, okay, it will still throw. Let me see. Okay, so now it is saying something weird. It's saying response status is 500 and blah blah. It is not able to handle few things here. It is not able to handle the exceptions. Okay, and now what I need to do is to add another class called as controller. I will have to say controller advisory class. Okay, and on top of it, let me make it a bit bigger. On top of it, I will add annotation called as controller advice. And what this class is supposed to be doing is it will listen to the exceptions thrown by the controller. Okay, so it will listen to the exception thrown by the controller and then manipulate it and only send what we ask it to send. Okay, let me show you that. So what we do next is we will create controller with the, where it go, sorry, we'll go here and we will extend this with the response entity exception handler. That's the first thing we do. So first thing is you create a class, then you add a annotation called as @controller advice, then you extend this with response entity exception handler. See, all this is hard to remember. It can happen that you won't remember each and every class, which is fine, and that's why we will be creating different APIs again and again and again, so that it becomes it comes into your muscle memory. But it's not very easy to remember these. At the same time, you don't really need to know what each class is, what is doing what. All you need to know is what to write for that specific thing to work. So for controller advice, you need to create a class. Step is you need to create a controller advisory class. You need to mark it as @controller advice, and then you have to extend this with the class called as response entity exception handler. Okay, and then you need to write specific methods which will be automatically called as soon as an exception is occurring. Okay, so I will write here one method. I will say public void, not void actually, response entity. I want to return response entity of, let's say, object, and here I will say handle employee not does not exist exception. Okay, and here I need to enter the exception which is being thrown. So I'll say employee does not exist, sorry, employee does not exist exception, and then I need to write web request. So this is the minimum what you need to do. Let me make it smaller. Okay, this is the minimum what you need to do. Okay, then I have to annotate this with exception handler, and here I need to mention what kind of exception this method will handle. So I'll say dot class. Okay, again, to summarize what I'm doing, I'm creating a class which will handle my exceptions which are thrown by my controllers. So if my controller is throwing an exception, it will not be able to directly throw it. It will just go and call these methods, because these methods are designed to handle those exceptions. And this specific method is designed to handle a specific type of exception called as employee does not exist exception. Okay, to do that, how we do that is using controller advice. And this is what I'm doing. I'm creating controller advice class annotated by this, and then writing a method, and then I am annotating with exception handler. And here I'm defining uh, what method will be called when my controller throws employee does not exist exception. Okay, what I write inside is now up to me, like what I want to really return when this exception is thrown. Okay, so I have many things which I can do basically, and I will do maybe simple thing. So I will say I'll create a map string of string map new hash map, and here I will say map dot put timestamp. I'll say timestamp because I want to return something which is which can be more standard. So I want to return the timestamp, and with timestamp with a message in a more of a JSON format. So I will say comma local date time dot now. So I'm just trying to send what date let me maybe mark this an object. Okay, then map dot put what message I want to return. So I will say here message as employee not found exception thrown with the message as employee, no, message as exception dot get message. Okay, and then I would like to return a response entity, because this returns a response entity. Response entity is an object which contains what is supposed to be returned. So anything which an API returns is what is two things: primarily what body it is returning, and second what status code it is returning, and that I can configure using this object called as response entity. If you notice, all my controller class are also returning response entity. Yeah, so same thing I'm doing here, because this is the method which will be automatically called as soon as exception occurs, and this is what it also sends back to the caller. So I'll say response entity as, so I have to create a response entity, right? So I'll say response entity, and I don't need to mention this, and here I can mention in the constructor the body is supposed to be string body dot to string. Okay, or I can maybe, instead of doing that, simply say body and then http dot, guys, can you please go on mute, dot bad request. Maybe an error code also I would like to send. Instead of this I will say map. Okay, uh create field response entity. Okay, sorry, I have to create a new object, a new response entity basically, and this will return the response entity with the body as this, message as this, an exception which I will be throwing with the message of the new exception captured here, which I am appending with the message, and sending the status code as bad request. As simple as that. If I go and run this again, let's see what happens. Okay, it runs, and now if I go back here, if I say try it out, execute, so now it is returning the standard message, right? This is what I created. I said timestamp, so it's returning me the timestamp, and saying message as employee not found exception thrown, message as cannot edit the employee with ID as 0. Okay, so this is now currently working. Let me trace it back again for you so that you understand what I have just done. I was here in the employee controller. I had a endpoint put mapping. Inside that I have another service call which is edit employee. If I go inside this, here it returns two things. Either if the ID exists, it returns, it saves it. Okay, it saves the edited version of it. If not, if the ID does not exist, it throws an exception. Employee does not exist, exception it throws with this, with some message, cannot edit the employee with ID as this. Okay, now I created a exception, employee does not exist exception here. This is the exception I created, and what it really does is it is a user defined exception, and it stores it extends runtime exception. And here I have a super keyword called, which actually calls the constructor of the runtime. The runtime exception is there with, comes with the Java itself, and it calls this one, and it does the internal things and on how it does. So I'll not go to details of how it is happening, how it is doing. All you need to learn is how to go and create your own custom exception. So this is how you create a custom exception, and this is the custom exception which I am throwing from here. When I throw this, it is being thrown where? Gets thrown here in the controller, because controller edit employee class or edit employee method calls edit employee service, and this throws employee does not exist exception. Okay, now what I really wanted to do is, when any exception is being thrown, something like this, and any exception is being thrown, I want to control it centrally from a central point. And that is the reason I went ahead and created a controller advisory. A controller advisory plays a significant role in centralizing the error handlings. Okay, what really happens in behind the scene is, as soon as any of the endpoint throws a exception which has a controller here. Okay, so I have an exception handler here of type employee does not exist exception, then this method will be automatically called. Okay, so the idea is when this throws an exception, the moment this throws an exception, it won't come here. It after this line throws an exception, it directly goes, Spring Boot directly goes and calls this method, executes this and returns this. Okay, and so this is how I centrally control my all my exceptions. Okay, I can do the same thing now. Let me go back to service controller. Let me remove this junk code because I don't no longer need it. So my code has become simple. Instead of doing so much try and catch in multiple methods, I don't have to do that everywhere. Just my service method classes return throws the exception. For example, in this case, my service class is throwing a specific type of exception, and my edit employee, the controller, is not catching it. It is just throwing it back, and controller advisory is actually catching it. Behind the scene, this is what is catching it, that exception of any of the controller class, any of the controller method is throwing any exception of this type, you have to execute this. That is what I'm trying to that is what I have actually done. So I will do the same thing for the delete, because delete also deals with the same problem. So if I go to delete employee id, here the same thing, delete employee id, employee repository exists by id, I can do the same thing here. So instead of throwing like this, I will throw this. Employee does not exist, I don't need to put it like this here. I will simply say cannot delete. Here I said cannot edit the employee. I'll say here, I'll say cannot delete the employee with id as, and here I'll say employee dot get okay, here no employee, I simply say id. Okay, and that's about it. Okay, and what I'll do now is, instead of in the controller, I'll go here to delete mapping, and I will exactly do what I've done for the edit. So if I go here and if I say throws like this, I don't have to call this at all now. I've centrally controlled it now. So here this also becomes simple, and I can handle the any exceptions of this type called as employee does not exist type. I can directly manage it here. So I am not repeating myself. This is how I reduce the code and keeping things at one place, so that I can manage I can manage the messages, error messages and everything, status codes and everything from just one point, and don't have to go through multiple places to change the same thing. Okay, here I am saying employee id is this. Okay, now if I let me show the example back here. So if I go here, if I do a put, try it out, execute, it shows me this message. But if I go to delete, try it out, I say one, execute, it shows me the previous message like this, employee doesn't exist, cannot edit, delete. But I want that to come in this format. For that, all I will do is I will refresh the API, stop, run again, and now my delete employee will have the same format. So if I go here, try it out, one, execute, it is also showing the same thing, employee not found exception thrown message as this, cannot delete the employee with id as one. So if you notice, I just have one controller sorry, exception handler, which is taking care of everything. So edit, this is being called when edit controller throws the same exception. This is also being called when the delete controller throws the same exception. And I can handle things directly from here. I can even modify things, right? So I can, if I want, I can have another, sorry, I can just modify things here, and that's be it. Message as this, and exception message. I can have another thing. I can change the layout of the message I want to return. I'll say exception message as this, something like this. Okay. Employee not found, exception thrown. I will remove this just to show you the how I can handle things centrally. Okay. So if I just do this and I refresh, stop and rerun. Okay, and this will now have an impact in both the types of error message. Okay, so I just made a change one place, and now I can see the results here. So I'm seeing the message as employee not found, exception thrown, exception message as cannot edit the employee, timestamp is this, and same thing I can witness here. Message employee not found, exception thrown, cannot delete the employee with ID as one, and timestamp is this. Okay, so this is the use case of controller advice. This is what is supposed to be you were supposed to be using for all the different kind of exception which your APIs throw, and this is the standard way of handling it instead of handling it the way we were handling it before, right? So here if you see in the controller we were handling it in here, we're handling it here, and we are in some place we are not even handling it. So example, in get mapping also we are throwing as generic exception employee name this not found. Okay, so for all this also you will have to go and create your own uh, exception handler in the controller advisory, and that is actually the more standard way of handling it. Okay, any questions so far in this?
Sir,
Yeah.
sir, controller advisor में sir will show that
Yeah.
slide. Sir, map string and object you are passing, no sir? In
हाँ,
this. So string is for what and object is what? Which
ये
for what?
okay, so this is a concept in Java called as collections. ठीक
हाँ
है।
collection framework. हाँ
हाँ, अब
collection.
कलेक्शंस में क्या होता है कि आपके
हाँ
पास की और वैल्यू पेयर होता है।
ओके
ठीक है,
हाँ
तो
हाँ
की किस टाइप की है और वैल्यू किस टाइप की है, वो दिस रिप्रेजेंट्स दैट। सो की हियर
ओके
स्ट्रिंग है, सारी स्ट्रिंग है,
हाँ हाँ यस सर
और
हाँ
ये ऑब्जेक्ट कैन बी एनीथिंग, सो दिस इज एन ऑब्जेक्ट, स्ट्रिंग इज
ओके
ऑल्सो
हाँ
एन ऑब्जेक्ट। अगर मैं
ओके
इसको स्ट्रिंग कर दूंगा तो वहां पे एरर आ जाएगा
या
यहाँ पे,
यस सर
बिकॉज ये कुछ और
हाँ
ऑब्जेक्ट है, ये स्ट्रिंग टाइप रिक्वायर्ड है, इसलिए मैंने यहाँ पे ऑब्जेक्ट किया हुआ है।
ओके ओके यस सर थैंक यू सर
ओके, एनी मोर क्वेश्चंस अराउंड दिस? ठीक है, तो इसको इम्प्लीमेंट करना है। ओके, सो अभी तक हमने जितने भी स्प्रिंग के कॉन्सेप्ट सीखे हैं मोस्टली इसी एपीआई में हमने कवर किए हैं, एंड दीज आर द वेरी बेसिक फंडामेंटल कॉन्सेप्ट्स ऑफ स्प्रिंग बूट जो आपको आना चाहिए एक एपीआई बनाने के लिए, वो हमने ऑलमोस्ट सारा कवर किया है। ऑफ कोर्स बहुत सारे कॉन्सेप्ट्स हैं, पर हम सारे कॉन्सेप्ट्स नहीं सीखने की ज़रूरत है, बेसिक्स तो पता ही होना चाहिए। दीज आर द बेसिक्स वी हैव कंप्लीटेड। अभी what we will do next is we will start creating the actual APIs. So employee Spring Boot API जो बनाया हुआ है इसी के बिल्कुल सेम मॉडल में हम लोग एक API बनाएंगे पेशेंट API, एक API बनाएंगे डॉक्टर API, और एक API बनाएंगे अपॉइंटमेंट्स API. Okay, I will try to show you one again. Okay, but it will exactly be the same. So all you have to do is ये एम्प्लॉय स्प्रिंग बूट एपीआई की जगह जहाँ जहाँ एम्प्लॉय है जस्ट यू विल जस्ट मॉडिफाई दैट टू बी कॉल्ड एज डॉक्टर। ओके, ऑफ कोर्स एंटिटीज विल बी डिफरेंट, तो मैं व्हाट आई विल डू इज आई विल गो एंड क्रिएट दोज एपीआईज फॉर यू बिफोर हैंड। सो मैं बिफोर yesterday I mean before tomorrow's call I will go and create all these three APIs to show you how it will be done, and you will have to actually follow the same process. जिस प्रोसेस से आपने एम्प्लॉय स्प्रिंग बूट एपीआई बनाई है उसी प्रोसेस से आपको पेशेंट डॉक्टर अपॉइंटमेंट एपीआई सर्विस एपीआई बनानी है। ओके, और एंटिटीज़ के जो एट्रीब्यूट्स हैं वो डिफरेंट रहेंगे, पेशेंट के कुछ और रहेंगे, डॉक्टर कुछ और रहेंगे, अपॉइंटमेंट एपीआई के कुछ और रहेंगे, दैट आई विल गिव यू ऑलरेडी, सो यू डोंट हैव टू थिंक अबाउट इट, you just use what I'm using. Okay, so that will be the agenda of tomorrow's session, where you will have to create these 3 APIs. Okay, also what I need from you tomorrow is that you be prepared with your GitHub repository. So what I need from you is that you will have to give me your GitHub repository so that I could see how much you have done and what are the areas where you are actually stuck, so that I could help you. So you can share your screen and show me what is error which you're getting. I will, on the screen, I will live session, I will tell you what are the mistake which you are making, and we'll try to resolve it together. If you do not do this, then I'm sorry, I cannot help you at all. I will have to move on with the course material, because I also have a deadline to complete these sessions, right? It cannot go till eternity, it has to end sometime. And if you do not ask questions or do not tell me where you are stuck, what are the problems, I will not be able to solve, and maybe in a month or two the course is over. Okay, so choice is yours. If you want to make use of, or you want to इस सेशन का जो भी हम सेशन ले रहे हैं इसमें आपको you want to learn, then you have to ask. Okay, Ashwini, you were saying you want to share your screen and show the error. Ashwini?
Like, 1 minute, sir.
Yeah.
Sir,
Yes, yes, yes.
hello. Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
अश्विनी, आपको आपको अपना साउंड बंद करना पड़ेगा दूसरे डिवाइस से, इको इको आ रहा है बहुत। Ashwini, can you hear me?
Hello.
हाँ अश्विनी।
Let's see my screen, sir.
हाँ,
So here it is assert that it is showing some error, right?
असर्शंस के बाद डॉट करो, असर्शंस के बाद डॉट लगाओ ना, असर्शंस के बाद डॉट करो, असर्शंस के बाद एक डॉट लगाओ।
यहाँ कैसे?
हाँ हाँ, इसको डिलीट करो इस डॉट को। हाँ, फिर से डॉट करो। ओके, आपकी क्लास ही इंपोर्ट नहीं है आई थिंक। ओके, आया आया आया। ओके, assert throws, okay. Can you go up, सबसे ऊपर जाओ।
आप ए नहीं ऊपर में जा रहे, नीचे नीचे
नहीं, सबसे ऊपर जाओ, क्लास में सबसे ऊपर जाओ।
ओके इंपोर्ट क्लासेस।
हाँ हाँ हाँ, असर्शंस, लाइन नंबर 4, इस लाइन को डिलीट करो। आप जुपिटर की असर्शन लाइब्रेरी यूज कर रहे हो, इसलिए आपको एरर आ रहा है। हाँ, ये लाइन नंबर 4 को डिलीट करो।
1 2 3 4 jupyter.api.test
लाइन नंबर 4,
1
ऐसे नहीं, ऐसे मत गिनो, साइड में देखो ना कहाँ लिखा है।
हाँ
हाँ
assertion okay okay हाँ
हाँ हाँ हाँ।
something is happened. For line number 4 I have to delete what?
हाँ, इसको हटा दो।
हाँ something is happening.
सिस्टम
And after
स्लो है
that sir,
आपका बहुत।
something is happened.
आपको बेसिकली असर्शंस, असर्ट जे नाम की एक लाइब्रेरी है, वो यूज करना है। जुपिटर
Okay
एपीआई की लाइब्रेरी नहीं यूज करना है, इसलिए आपको एरर आ रहा था। आपको इसको हटा दो, दोबारा से इंपोर्ट करना।
हाँ okay sir यहाँ
ओके,
यहाँ हाँ
हाँ वापस जाओ नीचे।
सबको
ओके,
ऐसा
हाँ अब असर्शन में आपने क्या किया, असर्शंस डॉट, जाओ असर्शंस, एरर जहाँ आ रहा है वहां जाओ। नहीं, उसको इंपोर्ट करो, हाँ दोबारा से इंपोर्ट करो। इंपोर्ट में
हाँ सर ऊपर
नहीं नहीं, उसी पे जाओ आपने। एक मिनट रुक जाओ। आपको बेसिकली, मैं आपको एक पिंग करता हूँ, वो उसको वो कॉल वो इंपोर्ट में डालो। ओके, देखो मैंने इसमें पिंग किया चैट में, उसे डालो। उसको इंपोर्ट करो ऊपर। तो ये लाइब्रेरी आपको यूज करनी है। ओके, फॉर असर्शंस। ठीक है,
हाँ
डॉट
अभी आ
हटाओ।
हाँ
हाँ,
अभी आ
और ये जहाँ आपका जो असर्ट इक्वल्स है, ये ऐसे असर्ट इक्वल्स, ये आपने असर्ट जो जे जुपिटर का, आपने जे यूनिट का जो असर्शन यूज
हाँ
किया है,
दैट
वो
ओके
नहीं यूज करना है, आपको हटाना है उसको। ठीक है, ऐसे असर्ट इक्वल्स नहीं करोगे, आप करोगे असर्ट दैट, यहाँ भी असर्ट दैट ही करोगे।
फर्स्ट वन
हाँ हाँ। ओके, एंड देन जैसे नीचे यूज किया वैसे यूज करो, असर्ट दैट इज इक्वल टू एक्चुअल।
ओके हाँ
नीचे देखो कैसे यूज किया है तुमने, देखो नीचे लाइन नंबर 49 में कैसे यूज किया है, कैसे चेक किए दो ऑब्जेक्ट्स को।
हाँ
तो
wait
वैसे
बेटा
ही वहां करोगे ना।
हाँ equals to is equals to
हम्म।
okay sir I will do
हाँ, ठीक है।
that.
ओके, सो इस कोड को ना, यू हैव टू पुट दैट इनटू गिटहब रेपोजिटरी। ठीक है,
Yes okay thank you sir
सो गिटहब में डालो।
okay
ओके, ठीक है, लेट मी शेयर माय स्क्रीन अगेन। देखो मैं फिर से बता रहा हूँ गिटहब पे कैसे डालना है। ओके, अगर आप गिटहब पे नहीं डालोगे, एज आई सेड, मैं आपकी कोई हेल्प नहीं कर पाऊंगा। ओके, आपको गिटहब में जाके अपना अकाउंट बनाना है। यू हैव टू गो टू गिटहब, क्रिएट एन अकाउंट, साइन अप कर लेना पहले। ओके, यू हैव टू गो एंड साइन अप। साइन अप के बाद आपको क्लिक करना है न्यू पे। जो आप न्यू करोगे तो आपकी एक रेपोजिटरी बनाने का ऑप्शन आएगा। यहाँ पे आप कोई भी रेपोजिटरी जो आपका मन करना कर रहा है वो, बेसिकली यू शुड गिव इट लाइक एम्प्लॉय स्प्रिंग बूट एपीआई और समथिंग। ओके, मैं जस्ट टेम्प डिलीट करके बना रहा हूँ ताकि मुझे पता रहे, आई नीड टू डिलीट दिस। यू विल गिव इट अ नेम एज एम्प्लॉय पेशेंट एपीआई और समथिंग। ठीक है, उसके बाद वंस यू डू दिस, देन यू हैव टू गो एंड क्रिएट अ रेपोजिटरी। ओके, वंस यू डू दिस, ऐसा ऑप्शन आएगा आपको, फिर वहां पे इंस्ट्रक्शन देगा कि कैसे करना है। ओके, फिर जहाँ पे भी आपने लोकली जहाँ पे भी रेपोज अपनी रखी हुई है, फॉर एग्जांपल आप अपने लोकल पे जाओ। ओके, एक मिनट, हाँ मैं शायद स्क्रीन फुल शेयर नहीं किया है। शेयर अगेन। Okay, so you will have to go to any of your place. Okay, maybe I will go to here. Okay,